Okay, today we will be talking about respiration, transport of O2 and CO2 in the blood, basically about how hemoglobin works. How hemoglobin takes in uh, how hemoglobin takes in carbon dioxide, releases carbon dioxide and takes in oxygen. So basically, this is more like you have to talk about hemoglobin and then about a particular type of curve, how the oxygen saturation curve shifts to the left and to the right. So you know that we take in oxygen rich air in our lungs. That lungs, from that lungs, that oxygen rich air, that oxygen attaches to the molecule called hemoglobin, and that is in your blood. And then that's blood, particular blood, then it goes throughout the body. After it goes throughout the body, it goes near to the tissues, and after it goes to the tissue, this oxygen is released to the tissues. And then at the same time, the tissues have got carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is released back into the blood. It goes to the lungs, and then it comes outside. So we have to learn the process which takes place in this. How oxygen is transported from the lungs to the different tissues in the body, and from there how it goes, and it goes to the different tissues, and from the tissues of carbon dioxide is taken in and it is uh, released outside. So you know, when you're exercising, the lot of carbon dioxide and lactic acid and carbonate, all they accumulate in your uh, muscles and tissues. So these need to be taken out. This carbon dioxide, which is released as a result of the respiration. Sound আসছে? হ্যাঁ আসছে তো।
Yes, sir.
ঠিকঠাক আসছে তো সাউন্ড?
স্যার আমার আসছে না,
কেন হলো?
খুবই হালকা।
এবারে একই?
না স্যার, এখনো না। স্যার আমি কেটে জয়েন হচ্ছে, একবার দাঁড়ান।
আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে। So that is the process which takes place. We wait for Shubhajit to join once more and then we'll go ahead. And Shubhajit has joined. আচ্ছা, Shubhajit has raised his hand and he has done well. এবার শোনা যাচ্ছে তো?
ইয়েস স্যার।
বাবা, এবার তোমার গলাও ফাটিয়ে আসছে। ঠিক আছে। So now we let us go to the slide and see how this mechanism takes place. First, I have to share. Here we go to the slideshow. Transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. এটা দেখা যাচ্ছে সবাই? Everybody is able to see this?
Yes, sir.
ইয়েস স্যার।
কে নো বললো? No, anybody? No. Everybody yes. Okay. How gases are transported, basically. So what is introduce what is gas transport? So this is the heart. Here is the lungs and alveoli. From the heart, oxygenated blood goes to the tissues, and deoxygenated blood that with rich in carbon dioxide comes back to the heart. Heart sends it back to the lungs, and in this lungs there is something happens, transport of gas. So this whole process which takes place here in this region, this is known as gas transport. So the blood transports oxygen and carbon dioxide between lungs and other tissues through the body. The gases are carried in several different forms. One is dissolved in the plasma, the blood plasma, the gas O2 and CO2, they are dissolved. Then they are chemically combined with hemoglobin. They are combined with hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. This is the second thing. And the third, it is converted into a different molecule. That is, it binds with hydrogen and forms bicarbonate. And this bicarbonate, when it goes to the lungs, it gets converted back into hydrogen and CO2 is released back. So this is gas transport. So basically, we have to study how O2 is transported in the blood. The first part is the goals for learning. Then you have to explore how CO2 is transported in the blood. So this will include understanding of the oxygen dissociation curves. Question come on the oxygen dissociation curve. So what you will be needing to know is definition of partial pressure, process of external respiration and internal respiration. So let us look at particular section of this is a tissue and this is the artery and vein. So 98.5% of oxygen, right? This is oxygenated blood. It binds with hemoglobin. One hemoglobin gets 4 molecules. And then what happens is that this oxygen is released. And then there is 1.5 which is dissolved in the plasma. So maximum oxygen, about oxygen, maximum, this is the alveoli which comes out. Maximum oxygen 98.5 is with hemoglobin and 1.5 is dissolved in the plasma. O2 is transported by blood either combined with hemoglobin in the red blood cells, 98.5%, or it is dissolved in the blood plasma, less than 2%, 1.5%. Clear?
Yes, sir.
So the resting body requires 250 ml of oxygen per minute. मतलब तब जब तुम ऐसे बैठे हो, you require 250 ml of oxygen per minute. We have 4 to 6 billion hemoglobin containing red blood cells. The hemoglobin allows nearly 70 times more oxygen than dissolved in plasma. वो तो जानते ही हो, 1.5 है और वो 98.5 है. So around 70 times ज़्यादा oxygen is dissolved in hemoglobin. Now, what happens with hemoglobin is that hemoglobin molecules can transport up to 4 oxygen. One hemoglobin molecule, 4 oxygen. Oxygen binding occurs in response to the high partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs. So what is partial pressure actually? So you take air in a particular container, closed container. So this air exerts a pressure on the walls of the chamber. It can be your lungs. And partial pressure is this air is made up of different types of gases. This air is made up of different types of gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen. So partial pressure of oxygen is only the amount of the pressure contributed by the oxygen only, not the carbon dioxide. Therefore, it's partial. Partial pressure of CO2 is the pressure only by CO2. If it is 1 bar pressure coming, maybe 0.5 is given by oxygen, 0.1 is given by CO2. So partial pressure of oxygen is 0.5. So oxygen binding occurs in response to the high partial pressure in the lungs. So what happens in your lungs when you take in oxygen-rich air? The oxygen it becomes highly concentrated, and therefore the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs, it increases. When the partial pressure of oxygen in the lung increases, what happens? You have oxygen, we have hemoglobin without oxygen. To this oxygen binds in the lungs and it becomes oxyhemoglobin. This is the oxygen molecule, oxyhemoglobin. In the tissues, it becomes different. In the tissue, the partial pressure of oxygen is low. So what happens? The hemoglobin then releases the oxygen to the tissues, because वहां पे tissue high pressure से low pressure जाएगा. So your blood has got oxygen rich hemoglobin, high partial pressure of O2, and then in the tissues the partial pressure of oxygen is less. So this hemoglobin dissociates its oxygen and it releases it to the tissues where it needs. আবার লাংসে উল্টো, অক্সিজেন হাই তাই জন্য ওখানে ছেড়ে দেয়. ক্লিয়ার?
Yes, sir.
সবাই সুনন্দা, everybody?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So when 4 O2s are bound to hemoglobin, it is called 100% saturated. With fewer O2s, it is partially saturated. So interesting thing is 4 hemoglobin binds. If one hemoglobin has got 4 oxygen molecules, okay, one hemoglobin molecule binds to 4, then oxygen atoms, then it is known as oxygen molecules. Sorry, it is known as 100% saturated hemoglobin. If it binds to 3, one is empty, 3 oxygen molecules, then it is 75% saturated. If it binds to 2, it is 50% saturated. If it binds to 1, then it is 25% saturated. If it binds to none, it is 0% saturated. So there is a type of binding, it is known as cooperative binding or allosteric binding. So this is the affinity, hemoglobin affinity for oxygen increases as its saturation increases. More oxygen, say first one molecule oxygen, it takes time for one molecule of oxygen to bind to hemoglobin. But once one molecule binds, suddenly hemoglobin goes into a conformation change and it starts to take in more oxygen, or its affinity to oxygen increases. Kapakap, then suddenly the saturation increases. Then again, when 4 is bound, then again the saturation decreases. Now let us look at hemoglobin saturation. Hemoglobin saturation is by the amount of oxygen bound by each molecule of hemoglobin. Each molecule of hemoglobin can carry 4 molecules of O2. When oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it forms oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin that is not bound to oxygen is referred to as deoxyhemoglobin. So these are the terms. So now we talk about hemoglobin saturation. The binding of O2 to hemoglobin depends on the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood and the bonding strength or affinity between hemoglobin and oxygen. That is, if the oxygen is rich, it's rich in oxygen, then what happens is that the partial pressure of oxygen is high. So if in the lungs the partial pressure of oxygen is high, then oxygen is released from high pressure to low pressure hemoglobin and it binds one oxygen atom. And the moment one oxygen atom binds, immediately the hemoglobin becomes more receptive to more oxygen atoms. So now we look at an oxygen dissociation curve. It reveals the amount of hemoglobin saturation at different partial pressure of oxygen values. So hemoglobin at what oxygen partial pressure binds to how much oxygen. That is the oxygen dissociation curve. It reveals the amount of hemoglobin saturation at different partial pressures of O2. So this is an oxygen, this is the partial pressure of oxygen in millimeters of mercury pressure, and this is the percentage saturation of hemoglobin. So gradually, when as the partial pressure increases, you will see that more and more oxygen goes. But when it reaches 100% in the lungs, it is saturated. The hemoglobin becomes saturated. 100% saturation at 100% PO2. So this is an S-shaped curve. The oxygen dissociation curve is an S-shaped curve. Flat slope at high partial pressure of oxygen. You have seen this is flat, and steep slope at lower. A kind of steeper slope. The first one takes some more time. So this is an oxygen dissociation curve. In the lungs, the partial pressure of is approximately 100 mmHg of oxygen. So it has got a high, hemoglobin has got a high affinity for oxygen, and therefore it is 98% saturated. So जितना ऑक्सीजन है उतना ज्यादा हेमोग्लोबिन सैचुरेट हो जाता है. That happens in the lungs. In the tissue or other organs, a typical PO2 is 40 mmHg. टिश्यू में ऐसे होता है, एंड इसमें एफिनिटी लोअर होता है, इसमें 40% सैचुरेशन होता है. लोअर एफिनिटी फॉर O2 एंड रिलीजेस सम बट नॉट ऑल. सब नहीं छोड़ता है क्योंकि यहां तक एटलीस्ट दिस मच अमाउंट इज लेफ्ट. When hemoglobin leaves the tissue, it is still 75% saturated. Tissues में when चला जाता है hemoglobin, it leaves the tissues and goes to another tissue, it is still 75% saturated. सब छोड़ नहीं देता है, कुछ छोड़ देता है. Hemoglobin saturation at high values. Lungs at sea level. PO2 is 100 mmHg. Hemoglobin is 98% saturated in the lungs. Lungs at high elevated, PO is 88%. Hemoglobin is C में सबसे ज्यादा है, लेकिन हाई एलिवेशन में 80 mmHg. ऑक्सीजन कम है वहां पे. Hemoglobin is 95% saturated at this. Even though PO2 differs by 20 mmHg, there is almost no difference in hemoglobin saturation. बहुत ज्यादा नहीं होता है. When PCO2 in the lungs decline below typical C values, hemoglobin has still a high affinity for O2 and remains also fully saturated. Now at lower values, at PO2 of 40 mmHg, यहाँ पे 40 mmHg एक्सरसाइज जब कर रहे हो नियर द टिश्यूज, hemoglobin is only 35% saturated. 40 has a lower affinity for oxygen and is 75% saturated. In vigorously contracting muscle, you would expect PO2 to be lower or higher than in resting muscle. This is a question for you. So as the PO2 decreases, hemoglobin releases much more oxygen to the tissues. जितना पार्शियल प्रेशर ऑफ ऑक्सीजन उस एरिया में कम हो रहा है, যতটা কম হচ্ছে তত বেশি অক্সিজেন ছাড়ছে. इट्स रिलीजिंग मोर एंड मोर ऑक्सीजन क्योंकि बिकॉज द टिश्यू नीड्स ऑक्सीजन, सो हेमोग्लोबिन को छोड़ना पड़ रहा है. जितना मोर हायर द कंसंट्रेशन ऑफ ऑक्सीजन, उतना हेमोग्लोबिन ऑक्सीजन को पकड़ लेता है. जितना कम है पार्शियल प्रेशर ऑफ ऑक्सीजन, उतना छोड़ देता है. बट छोड़ने का रेट इज समथिंग लाइक स्लो, वेरी फास्ट, एंड अगेन इट बिकम्स स्लो. ठीक है? Yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Everybody yes? Or everybody no?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Everybody yes. Factors which alter the hemoglobin saturation. Why suddenly saturation को कौन influence करता है? You know that hemoglobin is 40% saturated at 20 mmHg, and at different mmHg it has got different levels of saturation. Okay, sometimes this curve goes towards this right, or it goes towards this left. That means suddenly it can happen that at higher concentration of oxygen, even then the hemoglobin saturation is low, or at lower concentration of oxygen the saturation is still high. ये भी हो सकता है. At that is because when this curve shifts to the right or left. Okay, yes, no?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So factors altering hemoglobin saturation. So first one, to oxygen, you know, higher oxygen concentration, more saturation. Lower oxygen concentration, less hemoglobin saturation. First thing. Apart from that, pH, temperature, and partial pressure of CO2. This is very important. These conditions decrease hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, releasing more oxygen to the active muscle cells. So क्या होगा? This curve, it shifts towards the right. pH में कम कम हो जाता है, टेम्परेचर में मोर एफिनिटी बढ़ जाता है, एंड PCO2 में भी बढ़ जाता है. So exercise. When pH decreases, the curve shifts to the right. Increased oxygen unloading. So normal pH में क्या हुआ? एफिनिटी ज्यादा रहता है पार्शियल प्रेशर में, लेकिन एक्सरसाइज कर रहे हो pH. Why pH increases? Because your body is exercising, you have lots of lactic acid being formed, and this lactic acid, carbonic acid, they are formed, and they release H plus ions to form carbon dioxide. And this H plus ions, they increase the pH, they decrease the pH. pH गिर जाता है, acidity बढ़ जाता है. So when acidity बढ़ जाता है, you know the body is exercising and it needs more oxygen. Muscles need more oxygen. So the hemoglobin has to release more oxygen. What happens? इसका affinity for oxygen कम हो जाता है. So even at lower partial pressure 20 में, it releases oxygen, the saturation 25 तक पहुंच जाता है. It reaches up to 25. So it releases more oxygen. It's supposed to be something like 20, 35, 40 होना चाहिए, 20 partial pressure mmg, लेकिन वो नहीं होता है. जितना भी hemoglobin है, it is released outside. So this is the fact. Clear?
Yes, sir.
Hey, everybody tell if it's clear or not.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Because your exercise, you need more oxygen. एफिनिटी ऑफ ऑक्सीजन, हेमोग्लोबिन का को छोड़ना पड़ रहा है जितना भी ऑक्सीजन है. अगर ये है तो नॉर्मली दिस हैपेंस ड्यूरिंग एक्सरसाइज. दिस ऑक्सीजन सैचुरेशन कर्व इट टर्न्स टुवर्ड्स द राइट. ऑल्सो टेम्परेचर में भी सेम चीज होता है. टेम्परेचर जब बढ़ जाता है ड्यूरिंग फीवर और एक्सरसाइज, हीट इज बीइंग रिलीज्ड इन द बॉडी. दैट मींस द सेल्स रिक्वायर मोर ऑक्सीजन. सेम थिंग होता है उसमें. द सेम थिंग हैपेंस. Even if carbon dioxide increases when you are exercising, more respiration, more carbon dioxide is accumulating. Same thing. Oxygen saturation curve, it shifts towards the right. Clear?
Yes, sir.
So, first thing is oxygen अगर बढ़ गया तो oxygen affinity भी बढ़ जाता है hemoglobin का. But when say for example pH increases, oxygen it becomes less. Temperature बढ़ जाता है, it also becomes shifts towards the right. Increase in carbon dioxide, it also shifts towards the right. So this is a question which comes. What happens? What are the factors affecting the shifting of the hemoglobin oxygen dissociation curve towards the right, left? This type of question 5 marks you can expect. So factors affecting hemoglobin saturation: blood acidity, blood temperature, carbon dioxide concentration. So factors affecting dissociation, we have seen percentage saturation 40 degrees में कम हो जाता है. Here pH भी बढ़ गया तो इधर आ गया. Increased blood temperature, blood needs more oxygen, reduces hemoglobin affinity for oxygen. Hence more O2 is delivered to warmed up tissues. Blood pH, lowering of blood pH, making blood more acidic, caused by presence of H plus from lactic acid or carbonic acid. Reduces affinity for oxygen, उसमें और भी oxygen छोड़ देता है. That means your body is exercising and it needs more oxygen. And more O2 is delivered to the acidic sites which are working harder. Carbon dioxide concentration. Higher CO2 concentration in tissues, the less the affinity for of Hb for O2. So harder the tissue is working, the more O2 is released. So key point is increased temperature and hydrogen ion concentration is in exercising muscles affecting the oxygen dissociation curve, allowing more oxygen to be uploaded to supply the active muscles. Now we come to carbon dioxide transport. Carbon dioxide also relies on the blood for transportation. Once carbon dioxide is released from the cell, it is carried in the blood primarily in three ways. First, it is dissolved in plasma or as bicarbonate, HCO3 minus R from the dissociation of carbonic acid, and it is bound to hemoglobin. So, dissolved carbon dioxide. Part of the carbon dioxide released from the tissues is dissolved in plasma, but only a small amount, typically 7 to 10%, is transported, dissolved in plasma. This dissolved carbon dioxide comes out of solution where the pCO2 is low, such as in lungs. So when this blood comes near the lungs, their pCO2 is low. So high concentration of CO2 in the dissolved plasma, it is released into the lungs. छोड़ देता है lungs को, and then lungs releases it out. There it diffuses out of the capillaries into the alveoli to be exhaled. उल्टा होता है ना. Oxygen is transported in the blood primarily bound to hemoglobin through a small amount, though a small amount is dissolved in plasma. Hemoglobin oxygen saturation decreases. ठीक है? When PO2 decreases, partial pressure of oxygen decreases. When pH decreases, when temperature increases. Each of these conditions can reflect increased local oxygen demand. They increase oxygen uploading in needing areas. Hemoglobin is usually about 98% saturated with oxygen. This reflects a much higher oxygen content than our body requires. So the blood's oxygen carrying capacity seldom limits performance. So carbon dioxide is transported in the blood primarily as bicarbonate ion. This prevents the formation of carbonic acid, which can cause H plus to accumulate, decreasing the pH. Smaller amounts of carbon dioxide are carried dissolved in the plasma or bound to hemoglobin. So, into today's class, we had just talked about oxygen dissociation curve. Next day, we are going to talk about a term known as Bohr's effect and Halden's effect. So, is it clear so far? The transport of CO2, we have to have partner
sir.
কি বললে?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
আচ্ছা, হচ্ছে। Any questions? No questions.
No, sir.
Okay. তাহলে বাই বাই, আবার নেক্সট ক্লাস বলে দিচ্ছি। একটু মাঝে সাঝে অফলাইন এসো। Come offline sometime, some of you.
Okay, sir.
Okay, okay. Bye bye.